The devil, Satan, Satan, many different names from many different sources all over the world. Ultimately, the same thing. The essence, the entity that wants to prevent you from being your higher self. Some people identify it as a real entity, a real person, a real being, while as, on the other hand, some people identify it as something else, and we're going to get into that something else. You have God. God, pure light, love, abundance, all the things that we want. Now, when we think about these two things, the first thing, which is obvious, is that they are opposites. God is light, God is love. Meanwhile, Satan is dark, is hate. Now, when we go through the history of understanding Satan, understanding what Satan is about, it's important to realize, though, that there must be something deeper in that. There must be a deeper meaning in the understanding of what Satan is. Just like I always talk about the deeper meaning of understanding what God is. We're going to talk about not only God and how God is ultimately consciousness, the intelligence of the universe, and how you are a spark, a individualized expression of that grand consciousness. Your consciousness is in fact God individualized as you, experiencing life as you. And so when we think about Satan, when we think about the opposite of that, understand that from a metaphysical point of view, when we think about Satan's history, Satan came from God, right? Satan is in fact was a servant of God when we get into certain religious texts, especially Christian. And at some point, Satan decided to turn and go the other way and go against what God desires, wants. Therefore, that's this story, right? That's the arc of Satan. Now, when we think about ourselves and we think about the wholeness of who we are in consciousness, understand consciousness is the root. Consciousness is where it all begins. Your consciousness is the beginning and the end, just like God is, right? The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Now, if God created Satan, then does that mean that God has bad in it, right? Because if God created Satan, that means God had to have the ability to create those attributes, those characters that Satan, quote unquote, has. So when we think about that on a deeper level, then we realize, okay, if God created Satan, then those attributes of Satan are also within God. Just like from within ourselves, consciously, on our conscious level, our consciousness, though everything starts with us, there are aspects of ourselves from which the quote unquote bad parts of ourselves come from. Now, there are many levels to this, so I'm going to try to make it as simple as quick as possible. Our consciousness has different subdivisions or subsections or subparts. We have our consciousness, we have our superconsciousness, and we have our subconscious. Now, our subconscious is a part of us that from birth collects all the information, all the experiences, and comes up with some kind of conclusions, some kind of understanding, some kind of reactions about how to handle life in this physical realm. When we are growing up and we are experiencing certain things like fear, things like insecurities, even things like love, even things like affection are all programmed into our subconscious mind. And that is a big part of how we live our lives when we are adults. The ego is an expression, is the result of all of those experiences. So when we are somebody who has dealt with a lot of trauma, then the ego is created from a place of fear. The ego then has reactions and responses based on that trauma that we grew up with. You see, it is the ego that is actually the metaphysical devil that is within us. Just like God is within you, your consciousness, also the devil is within you, which is your ego. Understand that these two things are basically the contrast, the completion of who you are. These two sides are what's constantly balancing one another as you live your life. The spiritual practice, the spiritual journey that you are on, it's about understanding and balancing these two things. Many times, for many people who are not aware of their spiritual journey, the ego is outweighing their consciousness. The ego and all the subconscious fears and doubts and insecurities that they grew up with is overwhelming the beauty and the essence of who they are from their consciousness. As you focus on elevating your consciousness, it is important that you also deal with your ego. And when I say deal with your ego, I don't like to use the words control your ego, because many spiritual teachers talk about banishing the ego, getting rid of the ego is evil. No, the ego has a purpose. You must understand that purpose. And it starts with using your consciousness to communicate with the ego compassionately, coming from a place of understanding that all those programs in your subconscious were not your fault. But you have to learn how to communicate with your inner self to heal everything that has happened to you that created those fears and created those characteristics that cause self-sabotage, that cause destruction of your happiness, that causes suffering and pain. Once you do that, then you bring yourself into balance, because the ego does have a purpose. You see, when your ego, right, is gone and you've gotten rid of it, then you become somebody who is completely in a space of conscious living where you can't even acknowledge that you're in a physical body. You may be somebody who's running around the streets naked. You may believe that you can fly and so simply jump off the roof. Those are examples of a very extreme sense of not being grounded to this physical realm. And that is what the ego is about. The ego is about grounding you to this physical reality so that way you can play this game of life. When your ego, on the other hand, is too much and is overpowering your consciousness, then you are locked in and you are weighted. You are weighted with doubt, insecurities, fear, anger, frustration, hate. Ultimately, all the things that people identify that Satan is about. So these two aspects of God and Satan are really two aspects of yourself. You have to come to an understanding about these two aspects so that way you can bring balance and harmony to yourself. Realize that these two things need each other. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have light without darkness. You cannot have darkness without light. So realize that these aspects are aspects of understanding true balance, true happiness. And when you do that, then you are at the place of really taking on the spiritual journey from understanding and not from a place of shame, belittling, from a place of judgment even, but from a place of acceptance. You see, the spiritual journey is about accepting you, the good, the bad, and the quote unquote ugly, because we like to label things as ugly, as bad to create shame within ourselves. And that's also a part of the ego being mismanaged and out of control that does that. So when you come to clarity as to the roles that these two things have and the importance of these two roles, then you come into acceptance. Then you come into true love for yourself in every aspect of yourself. And that is truly on a metaphysical understanding of what the devil is for, what your ego is. Remember that ego is your devil. Just like God is within you, the devil is within you. You just have to come to a realization and ownership about those two elements being a part of who you are. And when you are, then you can understand the journey of bliss and true happiness and fulfillment. Thank you so much. Continue to join me on this journey. Peace and abundance always.